I think that everybody has like a defining moment in their life, at least one defining moment in their life. You know, one of those times where you can remember a before point and an after point, and that there's something happened in between that made a massive difference in your life. And you can remember every single detail of that event, every tiny little thing, when it was, who you were with, where you were, but more importantly, how it made you feel. And in scripture today, we read of someone who experienced one of the biggest before and after stories of all time. And, you know, it's hard to keep track. I have to admit, it's hard to keep track of all of the Marys that we read of in scripture, particularly those who come into contact with Jesus. There's so many Marys in scripture. And so it's hard to keep track of which one is which. And I think that that's where there's been a lot of speculation about Mary Magdalene. I mean, what do we actually know about Mary Magdalene? There are a lot of assumptions. And there's been a lot of stories shared about her over the years. Pope Gregory I, back in the 6th century, I think, made the statement that she was a prostituted woman. I hate to break it to you, but there is nothing in scripture that actually suggests that Mary Magdalene was a prostituted person. Of course, thanks to Dan Brown, there's and probably others as well, there's that theory that Mary was an intimate partner of Jesus or even his wife. Again, there is nothing in scripture to suggest that that is actually the case. But what we do know, what we do read about Mary Magdalene in scripture, is that Jesus cast 7 demons out of her. 7 demons. Can you imagine then what her life would have been like before that? We don't actually read anything of what life was like for her specifically, but we read of other stories where people were demon possessed and how that impacted their lives. Blind, mute, cutting themselves, banished to the outskirts of society, torn clothes. Can you imagine what her life would have been carrying 7 demons within her? And then Jesus comes along. She has this amazing encounter with Jesus, and he sets her free from that. What a transforming moment that would have been for Mary Magdalene. What else do we know about her? Well, she devoted her life to following him. She devoted her life to him. Along with other women that day, when we read about Mary Magdalene having the 7 demons cast out of her, there were other women who chose to follow, and it says that they supported Jesus and his disciples with their own means. So these women, they had their own financial resources. How they got them, we don't know. We don't know where that money came from. And again, we make assumptions. But just imagine what it would have been like to be Mary Magdalene before, to be living with those demons, to have this transforming experience with Jesus Christ, the Messiah, who sets you free from all of that bondage. And you live a completely different life. I mean, what would your response be? Surely it would be the same as Mary Magdalene's. She knew who he was. She knew that her life had been transformed by the power of Jesus. Mary's life was transformed in a most amazing way. So why would she not devote her life to him? She cared for Jesus' own needs. She followed him everywhere. She wasn't afraid of hiding at the trial. She was there at the crucifixion. We have no record of her saying or doing anything silly or dumb. And now we see her here in this passage, which seems a little bit odd to be looking at this passage when it's not Easter, but this is another. So she'd already been transformed, but this is another encounter, another defining moment for Mary Magdalene. As she goes to the tomb, she's the first one to find the empty tomb, the first one to see the risen Lord. and the first one to tell the disciples that Jesus was alive. Imagine that moment, going to the tomb, finding it empty, running back to tell the other disciples that the body was gone. Going back with Peter and John, they witness it and they leave, and she stays behind, she cries. She encounters two angels. That in itself would be an amazing experience. But then to encounter Jesus himself, the risen Lord himself, not knowing who he was at first. And let's face it, how many of us don't recognize Jesus when he's standing right in front of us? And he says one word, and her life is transformed. One word. He says her name, Mary. And her eyes are open and her life is transformed. And of course, I can just imagine her wanting to grab hold of him. And he says, "Don't hold on to me, for I've not yet gone to the Father." But can you imagine? What was dead and gone, what she thought she had lost forever, was now here right in front of her. I tell you what, I would want to be holding on to him for dear life as well. Her life was transformed once again. And what's her reaction to this transforming moment, this defining moment in her life? She shares the good news. So what we see here in this story is that there is a personal encounter with Jesus Christ, which leads to a transformation, which leads to sharing the good news. And when we have a personal encounter with Christ ourselves, we then become witnesses too. We become witnesses to his power to save, his power to rescue, to heal, and to transform lives. We become witnesses to that, not only in what we say, but how we live. And see, for Mary, people didn't need to know or be told how her life had been transformed. They would have seen her before. They would have seen the before life, and now they witness the after. She didn't have to prove it to anyone. She just had to live that transformed life. And how could she not? Your life, when you become a witness to the transforming power of God, your life will be a witness, a testimony for his goodness. So once again, just imagine that demon-controlled life. Imagine the darkness, the loneliness, the bondage. And then imagine that encounter with Jesus. And he sets you free. Now, we don't know what happened in that encounter. We don't know if he touched her. We don't know if he spoke a word. But in that one encounter, she was set free. And she was set free to live a life of compassion, to testify to God's compassion, to testify to his mercy, his goodness. And that goodness and that mercy and compassion was towards someone who others would have seen as being a lost cause. How does your life testify to the goodness of God? When we encounter Jesus and we become witnesses to his power, our lives will testify of this power. So Mary, as I said, she didn't have to tell her friends how her life was before. She just lived that transformed life. They knew what she was like before, and they could see the difference in her life. How can others see the difference in our lives after we've had that defining encounter with Christ? How can your life be a testimony to the power, the transforming power of Jesus Christ? No one could convince Mary that she was still the same before self. Her after self was proof. And no one, in that same way, no one can take away your story. It happened to you. And it's our most powerful tool that we have to share the love of God and the message of Jesus with a hurting world. How we live our lives, how we testify to the goodness and the power of God in our lives is our most powerful, powerful tool. Doubters can't debate it. Skeptics, they can't refute it. Haters can't argue it. No one can ever convince me that I am still the same old before self that I was before my defining encounter with Jesus Christ. And the after me, standing right here today, is proof of that. A couple of weeks ago, I spoke of the challenge that I received this year to write my testimony in 30 seconds, or to give a 30-second testimony. And I want to share that with you today, but I also want to challenge you to have a think about how you would share your 30-second testimony with the world. My testimony is this. When I only knew of God, my life was a mess and I believed I was worthless. I tried to find my own way to make things better until one day I actually encountered God and He changed my life. And now I live a life of freedom, hope, and security. And if He can do that for me, imagine what He can do for you.